Good morning. So I want to begin by thanking John Lobb and also Christina Rose for inviting me here. I am not a criminal justice person, but I'm very excited to be part of this panel because, as the title of this session said, I really do think these partnerships are game-changing moments. And they are game-changing moments for us to rethink the ways to connect research and practice. I think there is enormous potential here. So I'm very excited to be part of this panel and to be invited to share a couple of comments and reactions to the wonderful work we've just heard about, and to connect it with some of the work we've been doing at the William T. Grant Foundation. So for those of you who don't know, the William T. Grant Foundation, which is where I work, is a private research foundation. And our mission is to support research to improve the lives of youth. And more specifically, we think about our mission as supporting research to inform practice and policy to improve the lives of youth. So I think this, as an agency, we are similar to NIJ. Figuring out how to connect research with practice is a really, really difficult problem. But like NIJ, figuring out how to do this is a core part of our ability to meet our mission. And I think that, I mentioned before that I really do believe that thinking about these partnerships is a game-changing a moment, because it fundamentally causes us to rethink the ways we've been trying to understand research and practice. And I think the dominant framework that we've been using is one of moving research to practice. It's all about pushing research out to practice. And when we've been operating in this paradigm, we've been doing a couple of things. One is that researchers have thought about the problem a lot in terms of needing to improve the quality of research, right? So as researchers, we fall back on the things that we care about. And we think, well, what we need to do is improve the quality and the rigor, in particular, of research evidence so that it's more suitable for use. And we've spent a lot of time focusing on improving the rigor of what works evidence so we can better test the effectiveness of programs and practices. The other thing we've done is we've thought about this problem a lot in terms of needing to improve our communication, our dissemination, and our marketing of research to get it out there into practice. So communication, we need to communicate it in clear ways without all the jargon that researchers often use, to put it into briefer formats, clear written formats so that it can be easily read by busy readers. That we need to do a better job of disseminating research, distributing it in more effective ways. And then you see in the last couple of years, more and more folks building websites as a way of centrally storing research so that people can draw it down in easier ways. The other thing you see more recently is this focus on better marketing research. And this is the notion that practitioners are flooded with new products and information, and that we need to repackage research so that it can compete in this busy marketplace of information and products that are sold to practitioners. And the last thing you see is a big push to increase the adoption of evidence-based practices. That researchers are testing, and they have a larger and larger body of practices that have been tested and found effective in randomized controlled trials. And now the idea is, how do we push it out and get it adopted and implemented well in practice settings? Now, I think in the work that we do, and a lot of the work that we've done has been in education, but it's also because we're interested in youth, it's also in child welfare and mental health. We have found this paradigm way of thinking about research and practice is pretty limited. First of all, it's very unidirectional. It feels very much like a one-way street of just pushing research out to practitioners. And I think that as we start to think about partnerships, it causes us to rethink this relationship, right? We're kind of re-engineering the relationship between research on the one hand and practice on the other hand. And it's no longer just about how research needs to inform practice, but it is just as much about how practice needs to inform research. And so a lot of what we've heard earlier today from Jeff and Tammy is about how can the priorities, the concerns, the dilemma of practitioners shape research agendas and the ways in which researchers engage with practitioners. And it's putting these two communities on equal footing as they move forward. And so as we focus on partnerships, it causes us to rethink some of the things that we're working on. We're focusing on developing some shared commitments. So in education, they talk a lot about core problems of practice. So what are the core problems of practice that researchers and practitioners can identify and really work together on going forward? It also causes us to refocus on building relationships and building trust. And that was a huge part of what you heard from Jeff and Tammy. And then lastly, it causes us to focus both on improving research and improving its use, both sides of this equation. And in terms of improving research, it's not just with the criteria that researchers would use, right? Let's improve rigor. It's also about let's improve the relevance of research so that it really addresses the priorities and the concerns that practitioners are grappling with. And then let's also think about what it means to use research and what are the myriad ways that research can be used to help improve practice. So let me draw a little bit from some work that we have been doing to try to understand how and when practitioners and policymakers use research evidence. And what I want to do is present for you a topology of the different ways in which research can be used. And we could think about this going forward as part of the partnership work. The first is instrumental uses. This is when research can be directly applied to a particular decision. And when I hear people talking about the use of research, this is the kind of use I'm often hearing them talk about. That research can help people decide a practice that they want to adopt, a policy that they support, or how to implement a practice. It's research applied to a very discrete decision. But research can also have conceptual uses. It can help people better understand the nature of a problem, orient themselves to the issues at hand, and orient themselves to potential solutions. And this way of thinking about the use of research can be just as important. Carol Weiss, who did some classic studies of the use of knowledge utilization, said that probably the best research is most likely to be used in these conceptual ways. A third way of using research are political uses. This is when research is used to bolster, add weight and heft to a position that's already been staked out. So say a legislator, say an agency head already knows that they support a reform effort or they don't support a reform effort, and research adds to the body of knowledge that's used to justify a particular stance. Research can also be imposed, and we hear a lot about this in the last decade or two. That this is an example of this is when government funding is tied to the adoption of a particular practice or a particular program. So it's not a completely voluntary choice on the part of practitioners. It's rather an imposed use. And lastly, there are process uses of research. And this is not using research findings per se, but it's the learning that can come out of taking part in the production of research. So this is a myriad of ways, and I think it's important to keep these in mind as we think about the ways in which research might be useful and utilized. Now, I also want to shift gears a little bit and highlight some of the key challenges. So I think this work has enormous promise, but there are also some very tricky challenges, and I don't think there are any easy answers to these challenges. If they are, I'll turn it over to Tammy and Jeff to try to figure out what those are. But let me highlight them for you. One is long-term commitments. This is something we haven't yet talked about this morning. And I think this is the difference between dating and the long-term relationships that woman in Tammy's video was talking about. I think if we're really going to realize the promise of these partnerships, they have to involve some long-term commitments. I think otherwise we go from drive-by research to drive-by partnerships. right? You kind of quick in and quick out. But I think it's through these long-term relationships that practitioners and researchers can really grapple with some of the very challenging problems that practitioners face. And there can be an iterative back and forth as they work together on these problems. 2, we really need to understand how to do this work well. And so successful strategies for partnership work is very important. And in terms of identifying successful strategies, I don't think we can only look to what we consider successful partnerships. So if you're only studying the things that successful partnerships do, you don't know if those are the key ways in which they differ from unsuccessful partnerships, right? You have to identify the things that differ between the successful partnerships and the unsuccessful partnerships. And that, I think, will give you some keys into some strategies for doing it well. And let me suggest some types of strategies that we might dig deeper and understand from education. We have begun convening a learning community of research practice partnerships in education between researchers and school districts that are working together in long-term institutional collaborations. And one of the dilemmas that all partnerships have to face is how do they develop a joint research agenda that everyone agrees to work on together. And there's no easy way to think about how do you develop a joint research agenda that meets all these various stakeholders' concerns. Now, SERP, which is the Strategic Education Research Partnership, has developed a set of ground rules, which I think are very interesting to consider. In SERP, they say that they try to develop these agendas, these research agendas in collaboration, but they say that there are certain non-negotiables. The non-negotiables are the district leaders, the school district leaders have the final say in the questions that are going to be explored. The researchers have the final say in the research designs and methods that will be used to address those questions. And then SERP, as a coordinating body for the work that goes on in different sites, SERP has the last say in the approach to solutions and approach to the problem so that whatever they work on together has relevance for different sites or different districts. So I think it's coming up with some of these very practical strategies for doing this work well. Another strategy that the Chicago Consortium for School Research, they have a no surprises policy. Now, the Chicago Consortium has a 22-year relationship between researchers and the Chicago Public Schools. And as you can imagine, a lot of the things that the researchers find don't put the Chicago Public Schools in the best light. Right? So in order to nurture this relationship and to maintain trust, they developed a no surprises rule. So before the Chicago Consortium issues any report, they first share it with the Chicago Public Schools. This is not so that the school district can edit the report or offer any changes. This is merely because so that the school district can prepare their response to it. That the first time they see the findings or the report is not on the cover of a newspaper. That they have some time to figure out what their response is going to be. And I think that kind of a strategy and policy has helped the Chicago Consortium really maintain this relationship and maintain trust over time. Another challenge is related to funding, but it's a little bit different from what we've heard earlier today. And because funding, at least in education, a lot of it goes to project by project funding, right? For a research project or another research project. But when we're talking about partnership work, when a lot of it is about the dating, I love this analogy, this dating thing that has to go on in the beginning, where people are figuring out what are our shared commitments, what is our research agenda going to be, how is it that we're going to come to trust each other in this relationship? That there has to be some support to enable people to do that work on the front end. And if all the funding goes to project by project, my worry is that it draws research partners in particular to pursue the questions in the agenda that's important to the research funders, and it can draw them away from the key problems of practice that their practitioner partners are interested in. Incentives and capacity, I think Jeff and Tammy have talked about this at length, so I'm not going to go into it, but just acknowledging that you need incentives and you need capacity on both sides of the equation so that they can be effective partners to one another. And then lastly, this is something we see in education, and I am understanding that you see it in criminal justice as well, is just stability. In urban school districts, superintendents are churning over pretty rapidly. And in many of those districts, as their leaders turn over, so do the executive staff. And that makes it very hard for a district to maintain stability in its work, but it also makes it very hard to be a partner to researchers. And so that is a tough challenge, I think, for public agencies in general, and hard to know how to address. So next steps. John had asked me to suggest what I thought might be some next steps for the field. So let me just offer a few thoughts. One is I think we need to continue to build knowledge, and specifically of how to do this work well. And so I've talked a little bit about identifying and testing out some of these strategies. But not everyone is going to be cut out for partnerships, and certainly we're not going to develop partnerships for every agency out there. So I think that this work also presents opportunities for us to build some broader knowledge for the field beyond just partnership work. I think in some ways, I see these partnerships as little laboratories where researchers and practitioners are working together in intense collaboration and innovating to try to figure out how to really connect the two. And so I think in these close collaborations, researchers are going to have to figure out how to do work that's timely, actionable, rigorous, and relevant. And I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on us in the research community to figure out how to do that and to really innovate around our own practices of doing research. And I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on practitioners to figure out what does it take to really make sense of research and to put it to use. Right? I think that these laboratories, these partnerships are going to teach the rest of us some generalizable lessons about how to bridge these two worlds in effective ways. Second, you can't just build knowledge. We have to build capacity for folks to do this work well. And we've talked already about funding and incentives, capacity, time, and expertise to make this work happen. And lastly, I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us to also rethink our dissemination strategies. So once we culminate some of these lessons learned about partnerships and how to do them well, I think it would be a mistake for us to keep falling back on our old conventional ideas about dissemination. I think this is a great idea for us, time for us to really rethink how do we disseminate this work well. And one way I would suggest is that we don't just think about dissemination as pushing out information in a broad-based way, but that we get more strategic about it. And one way to do that is to really understand, well, how do people pull information in? What are the natural venues by which people pull in new ideas? And so I have been very enamored by this idea of capitalizing on existing social networks and intermediary organizations. Practitioners and policymakers often tell us that when it comes to getting new ideas, that there are certain peers that they really turn to, right? There are peer opinion leaders, or there are certain intermediary organizations that they really see as trusted sources. And we should identify who those folks are. And we should, I think, recruit them to help us engage in some of our dissemination efforts. And I think that may be a more strategic way, give us more bang for our buck than these broad-based pushing out approaches.